Hello. Miscanthus gargantua. We're going to get to this one later. I was thinking about what I wanted to read tonight, and it occurred to me that I'd be reading in Gloucester. So just a quick note, I sort of came to writing poetry through Charles Olson. I was living in New Mexico, and a professor really kind of turned me on to a lot of the things that were happening at Black Mountain. So for me to be reading in Gloucester as a student of studying what Charles Olson did is really kind of an honor. One of the things that I particularly love about Charles Olson is his famous essay, Projective Verse. And he talks about like what the typewriter is capable of and how in a single typewritten line, there's a human breath. And so for the first time, he argues in human history, we have a way of getting into the breath of the author. And so long way of saying, I love typewriters. I have a typewriter, many typewriters, I can attest. I have one at the studio that I try to shove as much stuff into as I can, typing on leaves and pieces of wood, and just about anything that I can get to type on. So this is a story that comes out of that work. It's also a story, I've read this a few times in public, and every time I think I'm done with the story, something happens in the world that brings me back to it. In the village of Mora lived Ukraine's most famous word butcher. People would come from all over Europe to his shop. In the cases were poems, stories, letters, and essays from all over the world. The Russian stories were, of course, some of his bestsellers. But the French poems were popular too, especially around the holidays. In recent years, some of the dark Scandinavian stories sold well, and other years it was something Spanish. This morning, the first in line was a literate man from the Crimean Peninsula. The butcher expected him to order a few meters of Russian novel, but he didn't. The man needed, he said, something much lighter. The butcher let him sample some Italian comedy, but it wasn't quite right. I think it needs to be something from much further away. American, the butcher suggested. No, I don't think so. Too what? Too masculine, maybe? How about something a bit more exotic? Well, it isn't for everyone, but let's sample some fresh comedy I have from Pakistan. I'm not sure. No, trust me, something about Urdu. I think you'll like this. The butcher let the man sample a small piece about a husband and wife. He loved it. No matter where it seems men and women miscommunicate. Well, I certainly didn't expect that. Is it all this good? Comedy is a bit harder to ensure such consistency, whereas Russian novel is always thoughtful and depressing. Comedy by its nature is hit or miss, but this Urdu stuff is fresh. Read. Let me think for a moment. You have other customers. Please feel free to help them. I'll just look around. Very well. Next, please. The next in line was a man who wanted Irish limerick. Butcher found some old stock in the back. It wasn't for him to judge taste. After that, a woman from a nearby village ordered Russian novel. It was bleak, and even the sample she had before she bought 2 meters was enough to make her cry. Behind her stood a man in a parka. The hood hid his face, but the Crimean recognized his general shape and his hands. He had certainly seen the hands. When the man spoke, the Crimean knew that the man in the parka was a neighbor, one who had been very active in recent events. He was very pro-Russian. The man ordered 50 meters of Greek and Roman heroic writing. Radical group members often rooted themselves in classic literature. The butcher knew this as well as anyone. In an earlier era, the butcher had seen a different type of rebel order the same thing. The man in the parka did not smile or look around at the other writing in the counters. He would have believed that he had already read anything that was important. He was after the very core, the heroic. As he was ordering, the Crimeans started to notice all of the sad and frightening literatures of the world, the German philosophers, the Holocaust literatures, stories of African and Balkan genocide, American slasher fiction. Comedy seemed so far away. The limerick order made him think that Irish humor could be just the thing, and not that exotic Urdu stuff. But the Crimean knew too well that Irish humor is too often rooted in pain. So much comedy is rooted in pain. On the way back to the counter, the butcher, with his arms full of Greek and Roman words, looked at the Crimean and raised his brows. At the same moment, the large man in the parka turned to look. Good morning, Victor, the Crimean said. The man in the parka barely acknowledged him. And with a lip gesture towards the Urdu, the Crimean said, "I'd like to buy 75 centimeters of that." We'll stay in the sad for a minute, and I promise we'll get brighter. A dear friend of mine, her mother lived on the island of St. Croix and passed away, and she was living in Albuquerque, and she had to go to her mother's place to sort things, where she felt very alone. She didn't know anyone. Her mother had moved there in retirement, and so my friend was there on the island alone. So I started a series of 50-word short stories about a girl alone on an island. And so these are some of those 50-word short stories. At night, the girl on the island shouted at the surf. The water crashed in reply. The shore animals absorbed the entire conversation. If they could endure a howler monkey, they could endure this. Besides, they thought her rhythm told them something about far away. By morning, she was always asleep. The girl walked back and forth, starting with a purpose and returning without one. 20 times a day on her path, she walked by a stand of palm trees, and each time she imagined herself climbing them by wedging herself in between and pushing up with her arms and legs. The first part of the climb was easy, but the trees grew apart more than she supposed. Had there been people around, she never would have attempted this foolish trick. Stretched a little too far, she could go up one more step, but going down didn't feel entirely possible. From this midway point, the girl noticed the parallel lines the waves formed as they entered the harbor. They reminded her of elementary school and the sound of kids yelling. She had not heard another human voice in a week. She closed her eyes and tried to translate the gull chatter. No ladder was forthcoming, no magical creature would get her out of this spot. The girl took 3 deep breaths and slowly let her left foot slide down just a bit. As it came to a rest, she leaned more weight to see if it would hold. She blinked the trees into focus. Before she moved, her brain scanned with where the beginnings of pain might be. The girl continued to breathe. She enjoyed for a second the view of the palm leaves silhouetted against the blue clear sky. The girl was thankful for the sand. She wiggled her toes and fingers, they all moved. Under her back was a hard object that turned out to be a coconut. How lucky, she thought, while ignoring her obvious reluctance to move from where she lay. Slowly, the waves became her father's scolding voice. If she didn't figure a way out, didn't figure a way to support her wrist, she imagined in 10 years, her hand would hang from her arm like a cow liver folded floppily over a butcher's thick-fingered hands. She knew very little about how bodies worked. This giant miscanthus. This is very recent. Very recent. I found these in my backyard yesterday, and it occurred to me that this is a plant called giant miscanthus. You cut it down at the beginning of the year. By the halfway through summer, it's like 6 or 7 feet tall, and by the end of summer, it's 10 feet tall. So it just grows. But I started thinking about, like, in the course of a growing season, have any of us ever been in one spot that long? That grass is growing there 24 hours a day, standing in the same spot for 4 months. I don't like, we all move around so fast. The grass doesn't. So I was seeing what the grass had to say. In time, we find that lots of things happen, but little really changes. It's in seasons, living hours. The sun moves. And the night reminds us to hope. In time, we find that lots of things happen, but little really changes. In the season's living hours, the sun moves, and the night helps reset expectations. In time, we find that lots of things happen, but little really changes. In a season's time, in a season's living hours, the sun moves, and the night becomes a backdrop to rehearse our worst fears. Sometimes these stories are hidden. In time, we find that lots of things happen, but little really changes. In the season of living hours, the sun moves and the night becomes home, as it is more constant. I tell my family some of the art projects I've been working on, and most common response is, Hugo, you're so weird. This is a project I did for my father, so it wasn't so weird. For those of you who don't know 50-word short stories, it's just an amazing way, like if you're living a super busy life, to go into the studio, go into your office and just like write 50 words, and you can tell incredible stories. So this is a series of 50-word short stories inspired by 1979 Detroit Tiger baseball cards. He got 2 tigers and 3 packs of cards, a hard baseball, and felt electric about an opening day birthday. Between innings, they ran outside to play catch, and after a few warm-ups, the ball skipped off his glove and smacked his eye. Being 9 is not magical. This is Milt May. Milt May was good. He was a solid veteran, but Harold loved the rookie Lance Parrish. With his healing black eye, Harold watched Parrish take a foul off the mask and just shake it off. Maybe he would try catching when he moved from T-ball to real pitching this year. Like John Hiller, Harold came from Michigan to Michigan from Duluth. Hiller was born in Canada, but he would have watched the giant warships start out from Park Point and make their way through Lake Huron. Surely they both loved their new team, but did Hiller miss his family too? This is the pride of Worcester, Massachusetts. Mark Goodrich. After the move and after Harold discovered baseball, his dad talked about the great Mark Fidrich. The bird was injured all of last season, but as Little League started and the grass was greening, talk of a May return excited Harold and his best friend Marty. They threw imaginary fastballs. Oh, this is Bob the Milkman reminded Harold of Steve Kemp. Bob was also the power hitting outfielder. They all seem to be power hitters on Marty's dad's softball team. Harold's father would work too many hours to play. He wouldn't have been a power hitter, though. He would have been quick and quiet. Imitating Johnny Walking-Fuss was the favorite pastime for Harold's team. Johnny would flap his upper hand and pat the bat rapidly while waiting for the pitch. And the kids would run up to anything, flap their hand and ask, "Who am I?" And the answer was always something like Johnny Vincent Puss. May 13th, throughout this story, all of the facts about the Detroit Tigers are historically true. So anything that's happening on a date throughout the story actually happened in sort of Tiger world. May 13th was Mother's Day. It was a tough morning. The boys lost the day before, and reading the paper, Harold saw that the Tigers had lost in the 9th. But their mother, with St. Paul connections like Jack Morris, brought luck. Morris pitched a gem and turned things around. Their mother was an occasional substitute at school. She taught Matt's class helping verbs and sang us at home too. Is, beam, or was, were, been, has, have, had, he, does, did, can, could, shall, should, will, would, must. Ed Lynn was a middle reliever, a helping verb. Rusty Staub was older than Harold's mother, but younger than his father. Rusty started playing professional baseball right after high school. The 1979 Tigers would have looked to a veteran like Rusty to learn how to be professionals. Harold wondered if baseball fields in 1963 would have still been in black and white. So the Tigers prospects card, there's 3 stories each day through the month. Each one of these players got their own story. What an odd card, Harold thought. Why were the young players in black and white? Even more odd to him, though, was the idea that the Tigers would need Dave Stegman, another outfielder. They already had Jones, LaFleur, Kemp, Corcoran, Walking-Fuss in a pinch. Futures weren't easy to imagine. Harold's cousin Dave, not Dave Tobeck, Came to visit after his college year ended. Matt and Harold were playing pitch and catch when Dave helped by placing a tall silver garbage can in an imaginary batter's box. They pitched for hours. Neighbors didn't love Dave as much as the boys did. Kip Young started the year in Detroit, but was back to AAA Evansville by June. Harold wanted to see a game in Evansville someday, but he had no idea where it was. He knew about Frankenmuth and Gaylord and Mackinac City and Munson and Ishpeming and Ironwood. They were on the 15-hour drive to Duluth. Milt Wilcox's mustache looked like Scott Hill's brother's mustache. Milt would surely have been much kinder. Harold once tried to sell a box of greeting cards. If he sold enough, he could buy a hunting knife or a hatchet. Scott Hill, when he saw Harold at the door, said coldly, "Scram." Ron LaFleur, the Ron LaFleur story, 1 in a Million, played late on CBS. Harold knew he was discovered playing prison baseball, but his parents didn't let him watch the show. LaFleur batted leadoff and led the team in stolen bases. Harold loved Ron, but he nor Marty ever pretended to be him. Harold and Matt were disappointed Dave Rosema's card wasn't showing more of his hair. When they went with their father to the barber, they both asked for a Rosema haircut, a center part with good feathering. The next day, without styling, the hairdos looked like bowl cuts with ear flaps. Jason Thompson, the smooth swinging lefty, twice knocked home runs over Tiger Stadium. His legend was far more important than his actual stats. Those weren't great. In 1979, the Detroit Tigers finished 18 games back, but for Harold, the season contained a perfect magic that could only be conjured once.